This report will be discussing the sustainability of Australian forest trails and the animals that inhabit them. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, sport and recreation on Australia's forest trails have become increasingly popular. By 2010, 57.6% of sports participants chose to exercise outdoors in the Australian forests and beaches. The impact on the forest trails from mountain bike riding, horse riding, bushwalking and trail running damages the forest floor and puts at risk the animals inhabiting these areas. This inquiry will investigate the strategies to sustaining Australians' forest trails and the wildlife that live there as this growing trend of recreation takes place in Australia's state forests and national parks. Trails are a necessary facility to forests and parks as they provide access for people for recreational purposes with the intent to avoid environmental damage to the forest by concentrating trampling to the narrow pathways. However, this report will discuss the impact associated with recreational trail use on plants, soils and wildlife existing on or nearby the trails. Some of the impacts of recreational use of forest trails include reduction of soil moisture, introduction of weeds that spread on the forest floor, and the loss of native vegetation growing on or nearby the trails. The introduction of pollution, invasive or harmful species, as well as pathogens can also harm the environment surrounding the trails. Trampling or crushing of vegetation near a trail can damage the native plants and cause them to grow back very slowly and in some cases not at all. This can affect the soil composition and disturb wildlife home and feeding patterns. Although animals such as wallabies, kangaroos and wombats may become used to human presence, the dropping of waste and food can disturb their normal feeding patterns. This can harm the animals as they may become dependent or at worst die from the contaminated food or waste. So what is being done to preserve Australian forest trails? Research suggests that if trails are designed correctly, avoiding steep slopes, boggy areas, known infested weed areas, and inappropriate soils, trail sustainability is achievable. The Department of Environment and Primary Practices have installed a code of practice for recreational users of the state forests and national parks to comply by. They state that to help look after the forest, users of trails need to stick to the trail, protect water quality, take rubbish home, and people must not cut down native plants or damage standing trees. This inquiry will question whether these practices are being utilised by the community and event organisers to successfully sustain this delicate environment. In order to preserve the forest trails as recreation in them continue, questions need to be asked such as whether these recreational sports, particularly large events, need to be monitored more strictly to stop the destruction to this environment. Are the sporting event organisers adhering to sustainable codes of conduct? Should and are there limits to event numbers per year? Australians should be concerned that the codes of practice already in place are being upheld and are sufficient as to protect the delicate forest floor and its inhabitants. There are organisations such as Leave No Trace that work in conjunction with sporting events to ensure that the forests are left as they were found. Their principles are that people using the outdoors for recreational usage dispose of all waste properly, leave nature as you found it, minimise campfire impact, respect wildlife, and to be considerate of other visitors. The main actions that Australians who use the forest trails can take are to follow guidelines such as these and the code of practice outlined by the Department of Primary Practices. People can make sure that the events they are competing in align themselves to ensuring a sustainable environment for the forests and their wildlife.